Hello, I'm Alice Hiller. A very warm welcome to this Voicing Our Silences website with SK Grout and Natalie Whittaker. Every time I read the poets I'll be introducing, I do so with doubled excitement, both for the pleasure of encountering their poems again and the anticipation of hearing them performed and discussed. Prepping for this workshop absolutely gave me that joy, partly for how SK Grout and Natalie Whittaker write the female body as an act of love. They each bring intense tenderness to the page. Turning first to SK Grout, widely published and highly active as a poet and editor, they grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, lived in Germany, and now splits her time as best she can between London and Auckland. Their first micro chapbook, To Be Female is to Be Interrogated, was published in 2018. Their second, What Love Would Smell Like, launched wonderfully in December 21 with V Press. With sensuous, interrogatory playfulness, its poems brightened and warmed midwinter for SK Grout's many fans in the Northern Hemisphere. Catching this light-filled mood, your name reveals it is always summer when we are in love. Then locates this statement relative to one girl reaching the point where she is able to love another. I draw my hands along the viola's curves, the violet's tears. We soon learn what love would smell like if it had a scent, light, sweet, blistered pleasure. This acuteness of texture lets us discover kisses as lime salt rebels, unexpected, economic. In Two Girls Peeling Apples, the idea of bliss as exclusively heteronormative is conclusively denied. Under the Sky's saffron rhythm, the poem answers, who would build heaven when this space exists? You'll be able to read more about SK Grout on the Voicing Our Silences website, and crucially, follow links to buy their books, as is also the case for Natalie Whittaker. A poet and secondary school teacher from Southeast London, Natalie's debut pamphlet, Shadow Dogs, was published by Ignition Press in 2018. Her poems have appeared widely in UK magazines and anthologies. Like SK Grout's work, Natalie's manifests a creative and aesthetic fearlessness in telling the less told story and speaking into the silences that for centuries have folded themselves around women's bodies. In Tree, published in 2021 by Verve Press, Natalie gives witness to what happened when medical complications led to the stillbirth of a longed-for baby and its toughest of psychological aftermaths. Dedicated to Sammy Whittaker, Tree begins and ends in blossom time, but passes through the dark winter of bereavement. The natural world shapes its journey from the discovery of the bare branches of faulty umbilical cords, failing to implant the sky. As waves of sorrow, the poems ebb in and out of Tree's central loss. They enter the church hall where broken moth women meet. They itemize the threefold departures of leaving behind the hospital, the child's funeral, and the bereaved parents' former relationship. The frozen beach of the stillbirth is located between 2 points of the 24-hour clock. To speak each of these experiences is nonetheless a transformative act of witness, which will help many. Reading both sequences of poems is enormously powerful, as you'll see when Natalie Whittaker and SK Grout share their extraordinary work. If anything feels difficult, there are links to support on the website. But for now, I'll hand you over to the joint stars of our show, Natalie Whittaker and SK Grout.
Thank you very much, Alice, for that very generous and wonderful introduction. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Natalie to you. Natalie Whittaker is a poet and secondary school teacher from Southeast London. She also offers freelance editing services for poets looking to put together a first pamphlet or collection. Natalie's debut pamphlet, Shadow Dogs, was published by Ignition Press in 2018. Her second pamphlet, Tree, was published by Verve Poetry Press in 2021. Natalie was a London Library emerging writer, 2020 to 2021. Please welcome Natalie Whittaker.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you for that lovely introduction, Alice and Sarah. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen so that you can see my poems. So let me just. Can we see that? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I think Alice gave as much trigger warning as is needed, but yeah, obviously the collection does deal with my experience of stillbirth in 2019. Okay, so the first poem is also called Tree. Tree. On the path to the station, there's a tree that marks the seasons. Look, baby, blossom. Look, baby, leaves. Look, baby, autumn. Next year, I'll show you autumn, and it will be so beautiful. The world is so beautiful. I will show you. One day I wake up and it's November. Bare branches are 40 umbilical cords, failing to implant the sky. So the title of this poem, SANS, stands for Stillbirth and Neonatal Death Society, which is a support group that I was put in contact with. SANS. One night, it is November. I steer headlights through drizzle, pull up outside a church that's switched off in the dark. Across a car park of puddles, a community hall squats like a secret shame. Its orange strip lights draw 5 broken moths, our wings torn off. Darren calls us all hun, says thanks for coming hun, pours tea from a cheap white kettle as we introduce ourselves to ourselves. Ugly shadows, sleepless, post-baby bodies with no babies. We sit in a circle of plastic chairs, stare down at Ugg boots stained by rain, and talk about our babies. Carly talks about her Evie's grave, the fairy lights, so she wouldn't be in the dark. Vicky hasn't slept in her own bed, hasn't spoken to her father since giving birth. She has a holdall and friend sofas. She's 19. I talk about not having a photo of her face, not holding her at the time, letting them take her too soon. How 4 days later we went back to the hospital, had her brought up from the morgue so we could name her. Tasha says mental health services are shit. They just give you drugs or section you, put you in a room where the curtains are held on by magnets, says, of course I'm suicidal, my baby died. And we smile because we know we have to meet in back rooms at night, broken moth women, swept out of hospitals and waiting rooms, sedated or trapped in wardrobes, panicking against the doors. So this poem has two subheadings, 1644, which is the time that my daughter was born, and 507, which is the time that I remember waking up from kind of morphine-induced sleep. 1644. Morphine dragged me under a wave, away from the white shore where my girl lay sleeping. She was a chipped blue pebble on a frozen beach. 0507. The tide washes back in, strands me alone on absorbent white sheets. My chipped heart has been wheeled away. Seabirds have pecked at my wrists, my eyes. Departures. We leave the hospital without our baby. Try to drive out of the car park, but the barrier is down. I push a ticket into the machine. Stay duration, 24 hours. Pay £10.80, but the barrier stays down. We reverse. Ask the man, can we please leave the car park, leave the hospital without our baby? The barrier is down. Pay £10.80. We leave the car park and a motorway is lowered in front of us. We have to drive on it. Lights swell on the Dartford Bridge. We've left our love, our baby, in a morgue. The night is lowered in front of us. It stays down. Insomnia. The moon as an eye stitched open. The moon as a wheel rolling my body over rubble in a wooden cart. The moon as a silver head dripping molten over what it cradles. The moon as drawing your face, then obscuring your face. The moon as having something small to look after. The moon as a ghost washed with milk on a cold night. The moon as my face obscured by milk. The moon as a white face washed by nurses on a cold night. Tides. I stand naked on a black beach, hacked by white water. The tide crashes in, carries ghosts of fish that bite the skin from my feet. Inside me, a tide turns. Spiral arteries are dying polyps, bleached corals on a calcified reef. Okay, and the final poem that I'm going to read from the pamphlet is also called Tree. Thank you very much for listening. Tree. Medical students perch around the room, drawn to our rare and bitter fruits. The consultant sketches winter branches in biro blue to explain what connects me to you, what's not getting through.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing those deeply moving and beautiful but bittersweet poems. It was really incredible to hear these poems out loud, and it feels very enriching but important to hear them. Thank you. So now we'll move on to the Q&A section. I often think about your first pamphlet, Shadow Dogs, in terms of place, specific to South London. Tree seems to me more engaged with space, or a particular space in time that you wish to mark and commemorate. Time also plays a really important function in the collection, particularly in the poems calendar, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and Clocks, and some of the poems as well that you read tonight. Do you want to say a little about these aspects of space and time?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great observation, particularly the idea of time. As soon as you fall pregnant, you're hyper aware of like timelines and time scales. You know, as soon as you get even like a positive pregnancy test, you've got a due date, and you've got a number of months, and you've got, you know, the apps that tell you, oh, you're this number of months along, your baby's this big. And when you lose a baby, that timeline doesn't go away. That timeline's still there. You still have the due date to get to. And then it doesn't stop there either. You've got the constant, oh, he or she would be a month old now, would be 2 months old. And that doesn't stop now. You know, I still think, oh, you know, she'd be 2.5, she'd be 3. And I don't think that kind of ghost timeline ever kind of goes away. So I think that time just afterwards for me was really kind of marked by a refusal to accept that time was going on, that it didn't feel right, that I was getting to the due date and we didn't have a baby, and you just want time to stop and for that to not be real and to go back to you know, when you were still pregnant, when, how things you feel should be. So I suppose it's that refusal at the time to acknowledge that time was moving on without me, and that's why you've got so much repetition of, you know, months like November, June, calendar, clocks. Like in my particular case as well, it was this weird, like it's just coincidence, obviously, but to me, this kind of pathetic fallacy to it, in that, like, I fell pregnant in May. And then we lost the baby in October, so it was 6 months, and it was just this kind of nasty thing in terms of everything was kind of good in the spring, and then we lost Sammy just as like the clocks changed and everything got dark, and it just seemed particularly kind of cruel, that timing. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Thank you. That was a really interesting answer, and I think you mentioned a little about thinking about repetition and form, and I remember when we first met, one of the reasons which drew me to you, and one of the things that we often did was have conversations about form,
Yeah.
and how form can be so integral in a poem. And I was always really interested in hearing about your experiments in form, particularly your ideas about compression. Form seems to play, like you said, repetition, a major role in this collection too, particularly your use of white space.
Yeah.
How did your ideas about form work with the poems and the collection as a whole?
Yeah, so I think that the particular form in terms of using the white space instead of punctuation, I'd been doing that a lot throughout the year like preceding anyway. So I was doing a master's at the time in writing poetry, and I'd just done a whole kind of submission, like mini collection, that were those kind of spaced poems instead of punctuated. So when I first drafted the tree poems, that they were always unpunctuated. There was never any question that I would use punctuation for them. It was just that kind of space form was definitely what I was going to use. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think punctuation suggests like control over the content. I don't think these are the sort of poems that can handle like a semicolon, you know, there's nothing that kind of nuanced or controlled about it. Control over the subject matter, control over speech, very much just the idea that these are things that were happening to me that I didn't have any kind of control or artistry over, or to the voice, the narrator, I should say. That all you can do is just kind of speak them with these silences in between. The poems that are kind of in a block on the page, so like Departures, the one that I read, they often kind of relate visually to something that's going on as well. So I suppose in Departures, you've got really kind of personal, emotional subject matter. But you've got the idea of like the car park, the car parking ticket, the payment, the barrier, all of these things that are very kind of regimented, and the kind of rigmarole and everyday stuff that you still need to do, and that still has to be containing whatever emotional stuff that you're going through, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, there's quite a few different forms in the pamphlet. The one that's probably the most unusual is the Google search history one. That's like a list, but there's like the little Google icon at each line. When I first put the draft of sent the draft of the pamphlet into Verve, there was one of those actually was at the foot of each page. There was going to be one individual Google search history after each poem, and the collection was a lot longer as well. And then I kind of made the decision in the end to just kind of put those together as a list poem. So that's probably the one that kind of changed the most. I think that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, especially about punctuation, I think, because that often is something that happens as well in the edit, and it's kind of, it is very, really an interesting thing to talk about that in terms of control and your situation. I'm also really thinking about the idea of the tree as an overarching metaphor in the book. Was that something that came with the writing, or was it something that came at a different time?
So before doing this, I actually looked back in the notebook where all the early drafts of these poems are, and the very first tree poem, the first one that I read, and that's the first one in the pamphlet, that was actually the first kind of draft that I had. So that was there from the very start, like literally like the title tree, and then on the path to the station there's a tree. So that was like right from the start, that was there. So again, that was just something that was never really questioned. I was like, yeah, that's what it is, that's what I'm writing. And it's because, again, it links to time. So, you know, literally there was a tree I used to walk past every day on my way to work, and it's quite dramatic in its kind of, it's suddenly blossom, and then it's leaves, and then you'll suddenly be like, oh right, it's autumn now. So it's this kind of really obvious marker of the passage of time, of like spring to autumn. But then as I began to write the collection more, I realised as well, so the cover of my pamphlet, so basically the issue that I had with my first pregnancy was to do with the blood vessels not implanting properly in my placenta, to make it really simple. And that cover, which looks like a tree, it's actually made of a diagram of that. It's like the spiral arteries that embed into the placenta. And whenever like the consultant was just showing me diagrams of that, it looks like a tree branching. So it just fitted really well as a title and a metaphor.
Oh, so it's something that sort of serendipitously, in a way, happened at every occasion. That's really interesting about the cover art as well. Okay, so this collective is one of voicing our silences and saying the difficult thing. It's incredibly brave and moving of you to give voice to this experience. And I remember at your launch, your publisher talking about how this is an area that's not often represented in poetry or even in wider literature. Do you want to say a little about saying the difficult thing and how you went about writing that?
Yeah. So I suppose from my perspective as a writer, as a poet, it was the only, for a while, well, still now, it was the only thing that I could write about, and the fact that, or the idea that it was something that you shouldn't write about didn't really at the time even cross my mind. It was, and I knew that if I didn't write those poems when I needed to write those poems, I'd probably never write anything ever again. And to be honest, I still haven't written anything new really since that pamphlet, but I've been I've had quite a lot going on since then. So I just feel like I had to get that pamphlet to stand on its own before I could ever write about anything else. Obviously my first collection's quite different, but yeah, anything to do with like miscarriage, late miscarriage, stillbirth, it's kind of in the middle of this like Venn diagram of like stuff you're not supposed to talk about, like women's bodies, death, kind of periods and anything related, I suppose, a third circle at the top. It's just in this sweet spot in the middle of like everything that's supposed to be taboo and not spoken about. And although my experience was a terrible experience, women in the past, it was far worse in terms of how it was dealt with, how you weren't supposed to speak about it, how you're supposed to just move on like that. Yeah, just some really awful stories if you kind of read up about the history of how baby loss was kind of dealt with not that long ago, like one generation ago.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of leads into my next question, because I was thinking about how to sort of write about grief, I suppose. And I remember reading a quote from Helen Macdonald, who wrote H is for Hawk, that it took her 5 years to begin to write about her grief. And I particularly remember this quote because it was more or less the same amount of time before I could start writing a poem after my father had died. So you felt this urgency to write the poems that you said just now. Do you think the pamphlet might have been different if you'd waited?
Yeah, I mean, so all that I can go on is the way that these poems came to me, which was crazily quick. And I would have thought in theory it would be the way around that you've said. But it was actually like a month after our loss, which was, that's ridiculously soon. I booked to go to Aldborough Poetry Festival, and so yeah, like we lost Sammy in October and Aldborough's in November. It was about 3 weeks later. It was really soon, and I went anyway because I was like, well, you've got to try and take your mind off things, blah blah blah. And I'd booked to go into a poetry workshop that I thought was an hour. It was actually 2 hours long. And it was with a poet who I love and really admire. And the topic was what would usually be like right up my street. It was something I really wanted to do, this writing workshop. So it's no reflection on the person leading this workshop. But I was sat there and they were saying, write this thing about where you grew up or relationships. And all I could think of, I was like, none of these topics matter. This is all just irrelevant compared to what I've been through in the last month. So I just kind of blocked out everything we were supposed to be doing, and I just found myself like just scrawling out these poems in 2 hours, and just kind of pretending to be doing what I was supposed to be doing, and actually just basically writing the first draft of Tree in my notebook. And when I looked back, there's actually 7 poems that made it into the final pamphlet that are there pretty much fully formed, or like 80% of the way there, just from that 2 hour session. So, I mean, to me, that's just how things came really quickly. And then I think another 4 came like a couple of weekends later. So I suppose to answer your question, if I'd have waited, they may, you know, the poems might never have come at all. So yes, they would have been different, and more likely I just wouldn't have written them. There would have been enough distance that I would have just not had that urgent need to write, or thought, oh, maybe that's something, you know, self-censored in some way, and thought, oh, that's something I shouldn't or can't write about. So I think maybe that was an unusual way for things to happen, but it's how it happened for me.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's, well, I think it's a beautiful collection. So yeah, and you definitely get that sense of urgency throughout. So I think, yeah, it's what happened. So incredible. So I was really struck and deeply moved by the poem Sands. It's such a beautifully held moment of deep grief, where you're able to give voice to the grief, but also let the reader in to this intensely personal moment. Do you want to say a little about this poem?
Thank you. It's lovely to hear. So yeah, Sands is one that came out in that first Aldeburgh session that I was talking about. I mean, everything in that poem is how it happened. You know, apart from any kind of the imagery to do with the moths, you know, the kind of metaphorical stuff at the start and the end. But other than that, it's very much just stating exactly what going to that group was like. It's what people, I mean, I didn't even change the names, which I probably should have done. And the strange thing about that poem was when I wrote it, when I first kind of rewrote from the draft and sort of typed it up, I was like, oh, this is rubbish. I thought it was like too literal. I thought it was just like a diary entry, which, you know, I suppose in a way it is, but I was just like, oh, this is the worst one, like so far. This is, you know, it's just, I thought it was really boring. I was like, I'm just saying what I did with my evening. How boring is that? Which it just shows what a crazy place my life was in at that point, that something that to most people is so alien and so terrible and so sad, I just felt like I was stating what happened. And then when you look back, you think, oh no, actually that's a very extreme experience. So just stating it is enough. And giving voice to that is enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, the reality is so powerful, and just letting the reader in, I think, is really so integral to that poem. It's really, really amazing. The collection ends on a note of hope, I think, a kind of opening out possibility. Is that what you'd intended? I know you talked about you wrote some poems and you left them out. Did you think about order? Sort of what went into kind of that kind of process?
Yes, so intentionally ending on a positive note, or a hopeful note, at least. Hopeful, I should say, rather than positive. I think the collection had to have a note of hope at the end. I think even just the fact that it, in terms of writing the poems and imagining a future where those would be published and future readers and a future full stop of something different going on in my life, was really important. So I think that had to have that kind of note of hope. In terms of the ordering of the poems, they're purposefully non-chronological. So it doesn't kind of start with, you know, like early pregnancy and end of the loss or end of the funeral. They're kind of jumbled up. So you'll see as you read through, you know, there's ones to do with kind of first expecting, kind of in the middle, and then maybe the funeral's like the third poem, you know, something that's chronologically very late, it's very early. So I purposefully made them kind of non-chronological to kind of reflect that experience of time being really disjointed and weird in grief. And about leaving, so in terms of leaving poems out, so the actual pamphlet is a very kind of winnowed down selection. So I think there's 18 in the collection, maybe, I don't know, something like that, not that many, like 20 or so. There were 35-ish tree poems that I submitted to Verve, or that I had in my original draft. And then I just kind of self-selected the ones that I thought held together best, or that were the most kind of suited to a collection. But yeah, there are others, or there were others, but I think I've kind of chosen the key ones.
Yeah, I think so. And final question, yeah, what, if you want to talk about anything, what's next, or what plans or projects you have going into this 2022 or beyond?
Yeah, so I suppose my only project at the moment would be, I suppose I'm at the point when I'm looking to put together a first full collection, like full length collection. So I've had like 2 pamphlets published now, like obviously including Tree, and then like obviously other stuff that's uncollected. So yeah, getting my act together to put together a first collection. I like to think that kind of Tree could be included in that with as a sequence in itself, but we'll see. Yeah, that's it really.
No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. Well, thank you so much for that, Natalie. That was really, really, really interesting, and just really interesting to hear about your process, but how you approach it as well. Just such a difficult topic, but you're able to bring such a light to it, which is really, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks, SK. Thank you. Right, I believe I'm setting prompt now, aren't I? For everybody. Okay. Right, this is when like the teacher in me comes out. Okay, so has everybody got something to write with and on? Yeah. Okay. So this is going to be like just lots of instructions from me, so just bear with me. So this poem, just to link it to that I'm going to get you to write this exercise. It's based on the form of the poem Insomnia that I just read. So the one that's the moon as, and all the kind of images and metaphors around that. So you're hopefully going to come out of this little mini workshop with your own version of that to some extent. Okay, so firstly though, kind of slightly unconnected for now, I'm going to get you to write a few things down, and I want you to do this really quickly, really instinctively, like literally 30 seconds on each thing, and I'm going to tell you another thing, okay? So the first thing that I'd like you to write down is one childhood memory. It could be anything at all, but it needs to start with a present continuous verb, so an ing. So for example, riding my bike downhill, baking cakes with my mum, yeah? So any childhood memory, first one that comes to your head, but the sentence needs to start with an ing verb. Okay, second thing that I'd like you to write down, something from the room that you're in at the moment, as simple as that. So it could be a pink picture frame, a green armchair. Okay, third one, something that you would like to do in the future. So for example, climbing Mount Everest, publishing a first collection. Just one. Right, next one. I'd like to write down a one-line description of a famous painting. So for example, it could be a vase of yellow flowers would be sunflowers, or a white face screaming would be Munch's The Scream. So a one-line description of a famous painting, or just a painting that you like. It doesn't have to be famous, one that you like would be fine. Okay, and final one, I'd like you to write down a song lyric. Any song lyric, could be the last song that you heard, famous song, doesn't matter, any song lyric. Okay, right. So you now want to start a new side in your notebook or a new piece of paper. And you're going to choose one of the three topics. So either the moon, the sun, or a tree. Okay, the moon, the sun, or a tree, whichever you're most drawn to. And what I would like you to do is write that, so for example, the moon, 10 times down the margin of your page, followed by the word as. So you'll have the moon as, the moon as, the moon as, 10 times down the margin, or the sun as, the sun as, or a tree as. Okay, so this 10 times down the margin. So you're making like a list poem. If you can just give me a little thumbs up when you're done, so I know you're done. Thanks, Neil. Brilliant. Okay. Right, so you should have 10 lines now. So you might want to, number them as well, because that'll be handy, because I'm going to get you to refer to different lines. So if you can number them 1 to 10. Okay. So we're going to start with lines 1, 2, and 5. So on lines 1, 2, and 5, I want you to come up with 3 visual images to describe your chosen topic. So I'm going to give you like 4 minutes to do this. So on lines 1, 2, and 5. So for example, a visual image could be a tree as a bony hand, the moon as a white face. Yeah. So lines 1, 2, and 5, you want to continue your line of something as, and then a visual image. Okay. Visual image or metaphor. Right, one more minute. Obviously, you can go back and edit these. Okay, so now I'd like you to complete line 3 using an image or a simile that involves a temperature. So for example, the moon as a cold stone, or the sun as a flame. That's rubbish, but you know what I mean. Something that involves a comparison to temperature. So a cold something, or a warm something, or a red hot something. And it could be, you know, something quite unusual or unexpected. Maybe try and subvert expectations. So the moon could be hot and the sun could be cold, possibly. An image or a comparison using temperature in line 3. Okay, right, if you could now look at line 7, and I'd like you to put in an image or a simile that involves the sense of taste. So for example, the sun as juicy orange marmalade, or the tree, a tree as dried breadcrumbs. What would your object thing taste like? What does it look like? Something that would have a flavour? Is it bitter? Is it sweet? Is it spicy? Okay. Right. And now the last thing that you need to do is refer back to your first activity. So you're just going to copy some of these in. So you're going to put the childhood memory into line 4. So it could be the sun as riding my bike downhill, or a tree as baking in the kitchen. So put the childhood memory into line 4, just directly in. The sun as, even if it doesn't make sense, that's your line 4. Okay, you're going to put the object from the room into line 6. So your line 6 might now be the moon as a pink picture frame, or a tree as a green armchair, whatever it is. Line 6 is your object. In line 8, I'd like you to put the future plan. So the future plan is going in line 8. So the moon as, or the sun as, or the tree as, whatever your future plan is. Can you put your painting description into line 9? please. And then last of all, your song lyric, which can be in quotation marks if you want, in line 10. So the moon as whatever the song lyric is. Okay, right, so I mean that's the prompt. So what you have now is a draft. It might seem like nonsense, but there might be half of it or a couple of lines that you think, oh, that's put some interesting things together that I wouldn't normally put together. So your kind of takeaway that you can, your homework that you can take away from this, come back to this at some point. Mix up the line breaks is one thing that you could do. So it doesn't have to start every line the sun as, the sun as, the sun as. You can break the lines in different places so that it's not that repetitive structure if you don't want. Another idea would to be extend one of the images or anecdotes further. So if there's one that seems to work, take that over a couple of lines, maybe cut out ones that don't work so well. And then see if just from those bits that you've thrown together, if there's like a prevalent emotion, are a lot of them quite happy or a lot of them sad, and just see if you can kind of lean into that emotion and just edit what you've got to bring out that prevailing emotion, and maybe have that emotion as the title, or have something as the title that's not tree or sun or moon. See if you can bring out what seems to be lying under the surface of these seemingly random comparisons. Right, did that all make sense? I know, yeah, good, okay, right, you've probably heard enough from me now. So, thank you. So I'm going to introduce Sarah, and then she'll be taking over. Sarah SK Grout is a writer, editor and poet. She grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, lived in Germany, and now splits her time between London and Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau. She holds a postgraduate degree in creative writing from City University of London and is a feedback editor for Tinderbox Poetry. Her poetry and reviews are widely published in the US, UK, Europe and the Pacific, including Cordite Poetry Review, Glass and Finished Creatures. She came second in the Ambit Poetry Competition 2020. Her poetry micro chapbook is To Be Female, Is to Be Interrogated, and a debut pamphlet, What Love Would Smell Like, is published by V Press.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That's really great. Now I will also share my screen. That should be visible now on screen for you. So the first poem I'm going to read is Shadow Symphony, and I'm just going to go straight in. Shadow Symphony. Okay, so you meet me. It's a run-in, a falling together, a saving of lives, something new, unexpected, unexpectedly building. Before you, there were sharp lines between light and dark. Now there's mystery, smudges, grayscale. Now color complicates. Shadow takes on shapes, places to take comfort, to hide. Light electrifies, magnifies, smokes too much. Breaking free of the prison of me before you. This expectation, this complexity, this painting of staunch cheeks to blush, this rush, a jailbird of feelings, feeling. You do not fall in love. You open your eyes, take a step forward, agree. Understanding that like attracts like, two negatives pulse together, burn bright, full of star wild, feel love. And the next poem I'll read is called Ursa Minor. I chose this poem because it is a poem about grief, which I've heavily disguised as a love poem. So I thought it was in keeping with the evening. Ursa Minor. There is a scar on your inner thigh that looks like a bear. And when I trace my index finger too close, you go, rawr. The balance of the heart, beloved, always. I walked up Lexington Ave once looking for Lou Reed, but maybe I'll have a better chance now that he's non-corporeal, spirit level. Bus journeys travel me, but never take me home. That's a place like Sunday morning coffee and two opposite words pushed together to make something delicious and startling, a moving place, a claw, a howl, ungraspable, like birds' wings in liftoff, always beloved, vine tight, non-corporeal. So the next poem, Alice mentioned in her introduction a couple of the lines, which was very kind, thank you. It's called To Jump Merrily, and it's also another poem that kind of travels the line between love and grief. And I think often you need to experience kind of the extremes of these emotions in order to fully grasp the happiness and the sadness that's happening in your life. So this is a poem that kind of contemplates those two states of being. To Jump Merrily. Lime salt rebels, her kisses fall on my skin, unexpected, economic, intense, a series of scherzos elevated from the mountain of her body. Just moments before we separated with slumber. In the grace of this twilight period, we wake lazily, skipping our faces across the muddled kindred we name LOVE. The gossip made bed gathers us in its sheets, twists a bit at the bottom. We zigzag trace, we forget, and I catch sun-kissed freckles in my teeth before winter's empire can reclaim them. Parallel to this runs the second plot. The night and I have not made peace. The dead still root me in the land that borders God. Sometimes my body makes mist from heat and air, but mostly I collect shoes that no longer have fellows. A downpour of light raises her from the bed, scratching her stomach, hitching her knickers as she slouches to the bathroom, calling the shower. The slaps of her feet against the floor jump with my breath. It is with a scowling that I wonder, why must we always reconquer our kingdoms? And the next poem I'm going to read is not in the collection. It's a poem that was published in a journal called Puerto del Sol in America, and contains American spelling, which some of us in the world also use, especially if you use Wordle. It's a poem that I guess is an interrogation or thinking about eco-poetry and queer eco-poetry as well. The title I would loosely translate it in my not so good French, but as it's always foggy. There's always fog. Il y a toujours de brouillard. These days, I open the bedroom window and receive my winged white wife. She stands in front of me with nothing on except her determination, carrying the weight of winter. I answer in weekends. How much toxicity does she meet in her day? My apartment stretches out, trying to capture the air, but in return, I am burdened with irritated senses. What do my wife's eyes tell her when she looks inside? I will dream of repeating building blocks, squander hope of touching ice pink petals. In the middle of another spring, I wake to my third orange husband. I don't know where he spends his days. At night, his cries skirl as if to slick the sky with vengeance and trickery. I answer in constellations. How many resource flights does he entertain, panting as the road falls off, when the code becomes all zeros and ones? I break. We meet at the kitchen table and I ask the wind to share their stories. The mountain is fading, as if I can bear wings or write with claws. Each step, each gleaming glance, I am locked out. The first man to build a fence knew how to create a divide. I have only factories, consequences, and walls. And this is my final reading, final poem in this section, which is called Only Halfway Through. Words shot from my body onto the page, unhipped from the star blue jar of night, dancing and levered through the pen, chasing the piano's melody and the harmony of twilight. I am stretched out for 10,000 hours, still learning. It takes seeing the answer before I ask the question. My body, like a solitary, spent time and exceeding the notes on the prescription, things I know. A girl's lips are softer than boys, but in the morning he will be more forgiving, meaning forgetful. What do we hear when we start to listen? The wind rustling amongst leaves like the song of maracas, the shake of gold, the stirring of the machine alchemizing coffee grounds and water, the tumble of indigo, the serenade of unexpected gifts, and the opportunity to choose both. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
You really, when I hear you read aloud, like I really get the sounds of your work, like the internal sounds.
Thank you.
So we spoke about the use of white space in my reading, in my poems. So of the poems that you shared, I think that the first one, Shadow Symphony, is the most experimental in its use of form and use of white space. Why did you choose that particular form for that poem?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that particular poem is kind of about being on the precipice. It's right. It's being before something changes. I mean, really, it's about falling in love, but it's about that kind of moment where you're swept away by kind of circumstances and things change for you. And so I really wanted to kind of think about how that might look on the page and how that kind of tumbling, falling feeling might feel like with the black words and the white space. So I did a lot of like experimenting with or trying out things like the unexpected line breaks, and words on their own, and especially the lists, because that signified the change. And I think if I think about it, probably, I mean, there's a number of, probably about a dozen poets I can think of who've really made a huge influence on my writing. And in particular, this poem owes a debt to probably Ocean Vuong's Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and Richard Sykin's Crush. And Richard Sykin in his interviews has talked about that particular collection being the poems are moving away from the left-hand margin. So moving to the center and to the right. So I was especially, I think, thinking about his work too.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love Ocean Vuong's book. That's so before like putting this pamphlet together, what's your kind of relationship to form usually? Do you ever use like really strict set forms like sonnets? And if so, what do you find the impact that has on your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really love form. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy reading form and writing it as well. I think I work in a kind of chaotic order, or ordered chaos. So sometimes it's about finding where the two meet. So I think formal poems really speak to that kind of finding myself into a routine, or giving myself a set of instructions, something strict that I have to abide by. And I think even like giving yourself prompts is a kind of a technique to kind of limit yourself, right? So you can all sorts of things like, you know, you can only write in tercets, or you have to have internal rhyme, or when you sort of tell yourself you have to do things, unexpected things happen. And I think it's a little bit about with your prompt as well. And I think, I mean, for example, I studied a poet at school, a poet from Aotearoa called James K. Baxter, and he wrote a lot of sestinas in his later years. And so I feel very comfortable with sestinas. I really enjoy writing them, and they're really enjoyable for me. But on the other hand, I have a real struggle with meter and rhyme and things like that, which I think if you maybe had a background in theatre or plays, or studied Shakespeare, maybe it comes to you a little easier. So I think it kind of, I think for me, form is something I really enjoy, and I do write structured form as well. But I do think about writing form as a, rather than like, here's my pantoum of the week, or here's my duplex of the week, thinking about what is the best, you know, practicing and writing forms, not with a particular intention as or goal at the end necessarily. I think there's a quote from an interview I read of Ada Limon, and she was talking about form as a container. She was writing a poem about addiction and drug dependency, and she decided to write a crown of sonnets. So it's this kind of repetition, the kind of getting yourself into that cycle and repeating it over and over again, that the form really works to. Or even I was thinking as well about Raymond Antrobus's The Perseverance, like the way he used repetition in that collection to kind of speak to his own experiences growing up and learning and kind of engaging and encountering the world that he had to keep repeating. And I think even in the poems that you read, right, that there were that use of repetition, that formal structure to engage with an experience is, I think, it's a useful thing to be able to to have an idea and put it in the container of the form, rather than perhaps the other way around.
I think that's such a good way of putting it. Yeah, choosing the right container for the topic that you've got. Well, so I mean, in your pamphlet, you obviously write a lot about women, which in some cultures, some societies still is can be seen as taboo. So I suppose, although we're coming from really different experiences or different topics, I think the one thing that we could say our writing has in common is this exploration of female bodily experience, obviously from different angles. So what was it like for you to voice that particular potentially difficult thing and to voice that silence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's a really deep question. I feel like there's a lot of angles to come at it. I think you're right about the taboo. I mean, it's still illegal to be gay in a number of countries in the world, and it's still really difficult as well to be gay, particularly in some European countries. And I mean, even here there are trans rights are being kind of taken away by either political or cultural kind of conversations and decisions. And I think I mean, Joelle Taylor talks a little about this in her introduction to Kinto and other poems, where she talks about it's still illegal in so many countries. And I think as well, as a queer person, that that you go through an experience of everyone goes through an experience of being closeted. And I think it's some people are very, very lucky and it's very quick, and others it takes a long period of time, or it might be your whole life, or it might be the majority of your life. And I think that experience of kind of that transformation, that change, I think is something I suppose is also something of an investigation. It's kind of, how do you write that kind of experience? And you talked about the female body, and I think Natalie Diaz is a poet that really talks very well about the female body and desire, but also manages to move her grief, turn around the grief into something that is a representative of desire. And I think, yeah, that's, even though that collection came out quite recently, a lot of the poems were over 10 years. So I knew some of the poems in that collection. So I think that was some of thinking about the female body or the beloved as a woman. I was interested in exploring. And I think as well, I mean, I love poetry. I love reading it, and I love, well, sometimes I love writing it, but it depends. When you're in that sweet spot, it's very nice. And I think there's something about it. It's like transformative, right? Like it's a creative, performative space, and you're able to make a leap from yourself onto the page, which then is another leap into someone else's kind of reading and thoughts and what they're hearing. And even today, a friend of mine messaged me with her thoughts on my pamphlet, which is really interesting. And I think poetry allows me to be authentic and real. I can express my realist self, kind of thing, but there's still a veil. There's still a veil that allows me. I'm a deeply private person, and I suppose shy as well, but it allows me, that veil kind of allows that performative leap, allows me to be authentic, but also maintain that privacy too, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great answer. What about the kind of environmental themes? You read one that you described as being an eco poem. I know obviously the environment is another really important theme for you. When did that arise, or how did that arise as a topic for you?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think yeah, it's really interesting. At my launch, my editor talked to, because I sent two pamphlets to her, One was What Love Would Smell Like, and the other was an eco poetry collection. So it is something that, and she couldn't decide, but in the end she went with, well, she mentioned it in her introduction. And I think there's sort of, maybe there's two parts to this. There's the kind of, there's the living your life in an environmental way, thinking about it in an ecological way, or whether that's, you know, conversations with people or recycling or activism or doing what you can in terms of, you know, transport or whatever it is. And then there's also expressing it in poetry. And I think to do that, it's such a, as you say, it's such a big topic. I mean, it's so political now as well. And we all know how hard it is to write political poetry. I think it's very difficult to kind of find your way in a way. And I think with such a big topic, you need to find a way in that's personal, I think. And I think for me, I hate to say it's a privilege, but I feel like it is a privilege now, you know, growing up in Aotearoa, or even maybe in other countries as well, that had such a close relationship with nature and was able to engage with nature really, really closely. And I think, you know, I don't see a lot of that here. And I feel there is something of a disconnect with nature with a lot of people in this country. And it's kind of a really sad thing. And I sort of, I'm not sure what to do about it other than to talk about it in my poems. I think as well, like, I think reading a lot of eco poetry is really important too. Or reading voices who are writing about the environment. I think particularly Indigenous writers as well. I mean, there's a really great poet from Aotearoa, Selena Tusatalamash, who's, I mean, a lot of poets around the Pacific are writing about a climate disaster, climate change. And I think engaging, reading, listening, I mean, they're all really important things to do as well.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's a really good answer. Loads of like poets I've never heard of, but I, you know, should look up really. Okay, so finally, yeah, I mean, same question to you that you finished with for me. Any poetry plans for 2022 or anything in particular that you're working on at the moment? Yeah,
I sort of I sort of made a list, and then I sort of thought, you know what should be number one is I should spend time with my pamphlet. It came out at the end of last year, and I feel like it would just be really nice to spend a period of time just being with it out in the world and kind of watching what happens to it and where it goes and feedback and stuff like that. I don't necessarily want to leap to the next thing too quickly. Thank you. Alice is showing it. Oh, I should show it to her, I suppose. No, upside down. Yeah, I think spending time with that would be really nice. I always just really try and be a better poet, just to try and find ways to be better and work better and whatever that is. I suppose specific things. Last year I began reviewing, and that's something I enjoy, so I'd really like to do more of that, maybe branch out a bit into essays. I suppose I have been thinking about projects as well, like an overview. Roger Robinson has this really great instruction that you just go out and write like 150 poems, just spend like months writing all these poems, and then you go back and look at them and figure out what your themes are. I feel like I've been doing that for like 3 years. So I need to like do some kind of thinking over the structure, things like that. So I don't know if that is working toward a first collection as well, but
it's a pretty ambitious plan. Go out and write 150 poems. It's enough.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to do that. I don't know, but that's kind of his one of the things he suggests.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I mean, I don't know about you, Alice. I'm not sort of aware that it's now getting towards 9. Should we see if anyone has any particular questions, and if not, we'll call it a night. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Yes, absolutely. No, that sounds really fantastic. I'm going to throw us, but I think I'm going to just yeah. I think before we throw it open, I just want to say that was a wonderful evening. I found your prompt really valuable, Natalie. I'm trying to write about a very early memory when I was 2, and it's a really difficult memory because my kind of language and perceptual skills were really limited at that time, and strangely the constraint of the poem just somehow let me into that space. And I think that's a really sort of, you know, a huge gift that we can give each other. We can't do for ourselves, but, you know, hearing other poets, being inspired by them, and then giving those prompts can be incredibly generative. And I'm sure if I went round half our group, everyone else would be saying the same thing. So you know, amazing readings, really enriching conversation. It was so interesting to hear what you had to say to each other about these excellent books. I was too excited. And also this excellent book, which is Natalie's first. I'm doing a sort of micro show, but yeah, no, it's really exciting to hear, you know, women writing the body from different places, but writing the body with love, writing the body with ownership, writing the body as a space of claiming and redefining and also expanding. And I think it just bears out to me, we've seen each other's work and development, we give each other support, we hear each other, and we say these pieces of work deserve to exist. And tonight is a lovely culmination of seeing that all come together. And so, yes, I would absolutely thank you both, and then say, yes, I'm going to go to unpin everyone. Would anyone like to ask? I'm going to just remove all the pins. And would anyone else like to ask a question? Let's, here we are. We're back, yes. Would anyone like to ask a question of Natalie or SK Grout?
Don't feel that you have to. No pressure.
It's such a richness. Everyone may just be sort of absorbing and processing. But
I wouldn't mind saying something.
Thank you, Angus. Yes.
It's a pleasure, Alice. So it's just lovely to hear your voice. I do feel lulled, so I want to sort of voice my statement question through that. You know, I'm surprised, well, I'm wondering how both of you, SK and Natalie, have found women respond to these projects. And I don't just mean respond in voice, like saying, oh, it's wonderful, you know, these are great poems, so glad you did that. I'm wondering about the layer beneath that, if you've noticed that, you know, with Alice's poems, like they're about, you know, not all of Alice's poems, but some of, you know, a lot of them are about particular subject, and, you know, I really relate to that subject, and I can talk to Alice on that level about a really difficult subject. You know, do you notice that with women about your poems, Natalie, about, you know, you mentioned the group, and that was great to hear about the group that you joined and their experience, and how the hospital had just kind of thrown, you know, like, off you go, take some drugs and off you go. But the group had found, you know, solace together and language together. So I'm wondering if both of you have found through the poems, have other women in particular really connected more deeply as a result of those poems. And I'm more curious to know if you've noticed what men have done around the sort of subjects and connecting with you about them.
Well, so I suppose what's been unusual with when my collection launched is that because everything's been like lockdown, I haven't actually done any in-person readings for this pamphlet. So everything that I've done has been online, or just kind of, you know, going by how many, you know, copies of the pamphlet has been sold and that sort of thing. So a lot of it has been pretty gendered in terms of I can't always see my audience or who's dropping questions in or prompts to readings. So it's actually been quite, it's not like I've been able to present the poems that much to particular groups. I would say that
good point, actually.
Specifically, kind of, there's been a handful of women who have gone through problems to do with like infertility or baby loss, who have messaged me like on Twitter to say like, oh, I've been through this as well, but that's because they've had that really specific experience. There's actually there's a poet called Betty Doyle, who's currently writing a PhD about her experiences of, I think it's infertility and IVF rather than baby loss, but she messaged to say, oh, I'm writing about your pamphlet to do, you know, within that topic. But obviously that's because that's something that bodily, at least, it's only going to be people with female bodies who are going to be experiencing that. In terms of just kind of surface reaction difference between men and women, there hasn't been really, I would say, enough in-person audiences for me to kind of notice any disparity. I don't know if you've got anything particular to add to that, SK.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know, I'm not sure about seeing it in that kind of binary of gender in a way. I think people have come to the collection, and mine has been out not that long, but what they've come to me about has been what they've enjoyed. So it could be the language, or it could be the erotic nature of the poems, or it could be the body, or it could be the handling of sentimentality. I had someone say they enjoyed how I made the sentimental something interesting. So I think similarly, a lack of one-to-one engagement in a group, in an offline setting. But yeah, I haven't really noticed a huge gender.
I'm curious tonight, it's mostly men who've turned up. It's mostly men who are visually available. I was just curious. I found that really, really curious, you know. You know, it's mostly men who are actually visually, you can see. There are some people who may or may not be here. Chaucer was here for a while. That's not a criticism. I was just really curious about it. You know, I just found that really interesting. I didn't know what to sort of make of it, and so yeah, I don't know.
We had quite a few regular women who would normally come on a Tuesday, and they had work or other commitments on because it was a Monday, so they're all going to watch and catch up. So I think if we reshook the audience with the people who are watching retrospectively, we'd probably get a balance, you know. But
well, I guess, you know, partially I'm really pleased to see that more and more men are open to more and more, not just tonight, but in general, more and more difficult subjects. You know, I'm really pleased about that. I've been involved in the men's movement for years, and you know, a lot of the men I deal with are very open to a huge range, but a lot of men sort of aren't able to allow themselves to be exposed to certain difficult subjects. So I was just, just for my own, I just found it really curious, and you know, I wondered if you had any thoughts about it. Yeah, so it's not a criticism, it's not a judgment or anything like that. It's just, you know,
an inquiry. I noticed that Simon's got his hand up to say something. So, Simon, what were you going to add?
Well, firstly to say thank you to both Natalie and SK. I have got a question, I think particularly for Natalie, but for both. Sorry, I'm hesitating exactly how to word it, but obviously you're writing about something extremely traumatic and personal, and also something that involves other people, although obviously not anything like it's your experience, of course. But I wonder whether you faced any either ethical problems or reluctance to write exactly what you wanted to write, and whether that came from yourself or came from a feeling of responsibility to others, or was that something that sort of occupied your mind, or did you just feel confident enough to say, you know, bugger it, I'm going to write what I want, I'm going to write what I feel, and that's it?
Yeah, well, I think the only, in my case, the only person who's as involved as I was in that situation, who's not explicitly named in those poems, of course, is my husband, who obviously he lost his daughter too. He was there, and there's a you who's obviously him in a lot of those poems. Sure. And I, you know, I would never want to write anything that would, you know, upset him. And obviously he read the pamphlet, and it's not something he enjoys, like reading back again, obviously. But at the same time, he also understands that writing is my way of kind of, I don't want to say dealing with things, it sounds too reductive, but you know what I mean, that's what I do. So I mean, that was my only concern, would be Tom, my partner's feelings and emotions around it. Other than that, there was nothing else that was in my mind as a kind of a barrier in any way, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I guess I'm asking if you felt inhibited at all by second guessing, or was it something that you left for you or him to look at afterwards? Because it's yeah, I guess that's what I suppose. I'm not being very, very eloquent.
No, I know what you mean. I guess just when I wrote the poems, I suppose it goes back to that idea of experience of grief, in that you're not always even necessarily thinking. I mean, this sounds really bleak, like not picturing a future. I don't mean exactly like that, but you're so just caught up getting through every day by day, that even thinking forward as to, okay, well, these might be published or these might be read or how might they be received, is so alien, because you're just getting through each day. And if what you need to do to get through one day is to write something.
And it sounds like a lot of them came out just sort of splurged out from your subconscious or from you.
They did, but then they also formed the kind of the initial drafts did. But then they were the kind of second year of my master's, so they were you know, like edited a lot, and there was a lot of critical and kind of academic thought around the actual final versions, even if the original prompt was what that original prompt had to be.
Thank you. Well, I mean, they certainly come across as completely uninhibited, and that, I think that that's what makes them so moving. And I think also, I remember Paul Burston, the writer, said that even if people share their stories with authenticity, I'm sure someone else has said this, but he was probably quoting someone else, but that even if they can't fully relate themselves to that experience, you know, for example, I can't with yours, that it still has massive resonance with people because of how it's shared. So yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you. So thank you for the question.
Yes, and also, I mean, you know, there are areas around mental health, around bereavement, around loss. There's a lot of common territory for people in Natalie's work, and also in SK's work, you know, around closeness, around intimacy, again, around loss, around kind of claiming yourself and finding a language in which to sort of set your marker in the sand. So even things which might seem to be have a narrow focus actually really open up to me anyway, you know, hugely. You know, we find ourselves refracted sometimes more easily than we find ourselves reflected. And you know, and I've both these books, I was really thrilled that SK and Natalie were talking to each other, because they're books that mean a lot to me, and it was wonderful to hear you talking to each other about them, and the difference actually made the conversation almost richer and better from my point of view. You know, the reaching out to each other was really wonderful. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
Right, well, thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, SK Grout, Natalie Whittaker, for an amazing evening. And the key thing is, if you don't already own their books, buy them and enjoy them. And I'm going to show them again with enthusiasm and some degree of chaos. Thank everybody for an amazing evening. Thank you all for being here, and we'll meet again at the next event.